IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. The ongoing protests in Israel for the last 3 months against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government have made headlines all over the world. Citizens have come out onto the streets to stop the Prime Minister's attempts to alter the judicial system, which they say will once and for all finish off the court's independence. After the protests, he has put a plan in abeyance for the time being, but Israelis have not stopped. The Prime Minister's plan will be the end of democracy. After the protests, he has put the plan in abeyance for the time being, but the Israelis have not stopped protesting. What exactly is Netanyahu trying to do, and do the protests have the full support of the citizens? Danny Ben Moshe, award-winning documentary filmmaker and academic, is currently in Israel shooting the protests and talking to the protesters and the experts. He is planning to make a virtual reality project, which he says will be of great significance for future generations. His films have been screened on leading networks around the world, including the BBC, PBS, ABC, and yes, in Israel. Danny also has an Indian connection. His film Shalom Bollywood, The Untold Story of Indian Cinema, is about the contribution of Jews to Hindi films. Ben Moshe himself is Jewish, and we reached out to ask him what was happening in Israel and what was he seeing on a daily basis. Danny Ben Moshe, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
First question, because I've been following a little bit of your work after you made the documentary on India. This is kind of here and happening. How did you find yourselves covering the protest? Did you go there to shoot or happen to be there and thought of making this documentary you speak of?
No, as a documentarian, really what you've got to do is follow the story. And unfortunately, the story is not always round the corner from where you live. And also as a documentarian, you have to be passionate about the story. I'm Jewish. I've lived in Israel previously. I have a great interest in what's going on in Israel. And really, when we're speaking today, it's just over 3 months since the movements began in Israel. And sometimes a protest will go and it will be on a weekend and then that's it. And everyone goes back to their normal life. These protests I've been watching from afar. I live in Australia, have just been gathering greater and greater momentum. More people, more locations, more passion. And I really I missed being able to participate in them because of what the stakes were so high. Sometimes, historic moments occur. I was in the UK not that long ago when the Queen, may she rest in peace, passed away. I'm making a documentary at the moment for the BBC, and I was in the BBC building looking down on the newsroom floor as the news was coming in, and then being there at the time of her funeral and the memorial, and you kind of feel you're part of these historical moments. And what's going on in Israel now is such a moment. So one, I missed that, being able to be part of it just personally and experiencing it personally. But then this might sound a little weird, but let me explain. I have these kind of little fantasies about time travel. Where would I go? Where could I go if I could travel in time? And I would have loved to have been in Israel in 1948 when it declared independence, or in 1967 after the Six-Day War when people descended in their thousands to the Kotel, the Western Wall, at the end of the war. And not all my travel fantasies are Jewish, by the way, and then I thought, wow, if we just, for some reason, I woke up a week ago and I thought these protests need to be captured in virtual reality. The 360 round shooting that you wear with a headset. So it's not that just like you're looking at it, but it's you're there and you're experiencing it. You're part of it. And I wanted to do that not just now for people to understand now what is going on, but also if there are weird people like me down the track and they want to look at how some of these historic moments pan out, then they would be this footage would enable them to do so. And you know, before we were recording, I gave an example. Imagine the moment when the Indian flag went up on independence. If you could have not just watched the archive of that in black and white, but actually be immersed in that environment, your understanding of it, your feel for it, the emotion of it would be that much clearer. So basically I realized that these protests were really coming to a critical head. And they were coming to a critical head because the Passover holiday is coming up here in Israel, which is a big national holiday. I don't know if it's equivalent to Diwali, but a major, major national holiday. And I realized I had to get this now. What I didn't, and I arrived in the country on Saturday, and I filmed the main protest, which was the largest protest ever so far, on Saturday night in Tel Aviv. And then on Sunday, unprecedented events happened in this country, and I just fortunately was here and was able to film the blocking of the main freeway. And then on Sunday, the demonstration in the Knesset with 80 to 100,000 people. And everyone said to me, of the 3 months of protests, I got the 3 biggest days so far. So I was very fortunate. The documentary gods were looking down on me. And I was very fortunate to be here at this time, and that's really the long answer of why I chose to make this film now and to make it in the way I am.
So you reacted like, because you were seeing them grow and grow and grow. And I was surprised you mentioned they've been going on for 3 months. Protests usually happen for about 4 or 5 days and then taper out for various reasons. And they're showing no signs of going away for the time being. They've made the Prime Minister slightly take a step back. What are they about?
Well, I think what they're about explains why the momentum is gathering, because I think you're right, you know, protests, people are coming out every Saturday night. They're not sitting at home watching TV. They're not going to see a movie. And the numbers are growing and growing. I don't know, in terms of India, I mean, you're a massive population. The numbers of protests, I'm not good at maths, but we'd be talking about hundreds of millions of people coming out every week. I mean, that's the scale, proportionally the equivalent, that's the scale of what is taking place here. And why are people coming out? So basically, Israel's founding document, the Declaration of Independence, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but its founding document is the Declaration of Independence, which really says 2 things. Israel is a Jewish and a democratic state. And that means it's Jewish in its national character, its public holidays, the colours of its flag, things that are not actually that dissimilar to India. But it is a state where everyone has the right to vote and everyone is protected under the law. Everyone is equal under the law. You cannot be discriminated. It's a Jewish state, but you cannot be discriminated against because you are not Jewish. What's happened earlier this year, Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, formed a government. There was a national election. And in Israel, governments it's a bit like Italy, coalition governments. You can have 4, 5, 6, 7 parties form the coalition. And this coalition was the most extremist. Israel's had right-wing coalitions and conservative coalitions over many years, but still an acceptance of the fundamental values of democracy and the rule of law. Here, Netanyahu formed a coalition with 2 parties that were extreme. Jewish Home was one of them. And the proposal was to enact legislation that would change the governance and the role of law and the Supreme Court in the country. And I'll just explain a couple of things. Basically, the Supreme Court here is, a court, and a Supreme Court is a really important check and balance on government. That's a basic of, the Westminster system, the government system. Israel only has one chamber in its parliament. There's not a second house like the House of Lords in the UK or the Congress and Senate in America. It has one chamber. So the High Court, the Supreme Court is a very important check and balance, and has traditionally been very activist. Israel's a very mobilized, politicized society. So the government will propose a law, a civil society group will contest the law in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court say, no, this will be legal or illegal. Legal and illegal, particularly under, I don't want to go into too much detail, a series of quasi-constitutional laws, I think 7 laws, that guarantee sort of fundamental human rights and equality. The government came along with a very extremist agenda, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because these protests are on 2 levels of concern. One is the immediate legislative concern about changing the law, and then the other, and arguably the most important, is what could happen if the law is passed. So in fairly basic terms, just to explain it, there are two key aspects of the legislative reform. One was of the appointment of judges. The appointment of judges here is, there's a committee made up of jurists, of lawyers from the Israel Bar Association and the government. So essentially there has to be a consensus reached that the judges are agreeable to everyone, professionally, everything. The law is to change that, and it, in simple terms, gives the government the power to appoint Supreme Court justices. So the risk there is they appoint stooges, someone who will do their bidding, someone who will not take the law as the priority over an interest to the governing party. That's one.
Because they've been appointed by the the government.
Exactly. So that's one. And Israel has a very proud, very fierce, very active judiciary. Israel is a modern state, but Jews are an ancient people, and we came into being a people with 5 books of Moses, the Old Testament. Law and the adherence to law is something that goes very deep in the Jewish tradition. And, without getting biblical, Abraham, Moses, these are people, the patriarchs, they argued with God. Well, here comes along and saying, no, we appoint a Supreme Court, and the judges just basically, the fear is that they would just bow to whatever the government want to do, which would fly in the face of the history of the legal, independent judiciary that's been in this country now for almost 75 years of its existence. So that's one. The other thing is there are these quasi-constitutional laws that guarantee fundamental rights, fundamental human rights. And the government, these quasi-constitutional laws that govern in basic human rights. I'm just repeating that, by the way, because of the pings of my email. And the government want to change that. So the government can override any law. If there's a conflict between the quasi-constitutional law and the government policy, they can just override it. So that's basically it in a nutshell. But why are people so impassioned about this? Because the extremist parties that are in the coalition now, very opposed to some fundamental rights for all sectors of the community. Israel, over 20% of its population is an Arab minority. You have a sizable Muslim minority. You have other minorities in India. Israel has a sizable Muslim Arab, Christian and Muslim minority. Israel, while it's a Jewish state, it's also a secular state. So in the city I'm speaking to you from, Tel Aviv, an incredible city, the majority of people are secular. They're Jewish, they identify as Jews, They would celebrate the main Jewish festivals, but they're not going to be wearing a skull cap, a yarmulke. They will get in a car on the Sabbath and drive, which someone religious would not do. So they're secular. And there is a real fear in this country that has this long tension between religious and secular. The government will come in, and they've already proposed certain things to limit secular freedoms. So essentially, there's the concern that Israel could move in a theocratic direction. The government could come along, then the government are not doing this, but this is the concern, and there are elements in the government who wish for this and advocate for this and say, we want to have religious law, basically. Imagine how in Iran in the 1970s, it was a very liberal, progressive place under the Shah, oppressive under the Shah of Iran, but culturally very liberal. And then the Ayatollah comes in, and all that freedom goes away. So there have been ministers who have said, wanting to limit freedoms of women or freedoms of gay people. And if there's no Supreme Court empowered to stop them, that could happen. So that's basically what it's all about.
Yeah. It does explain, because as you said, the Supreme Court has been activist, and I read some of what the Supreme Court has done over the last few years. It's even gone and overturned political decisions. It has overturned anything to limit LGBTQ communities, and basically on many occasions told the government this will not do. And there is no stopping if these laws goes through. There's no stopping what this government could and would do. Is that what you're saying, right?
Correct. Basically. So if, for example, the government came along and said, you know what, we feel that the balance between the role of the judiciary and the government is not working perfectly and there's a need for reform, I think a lot of people might say, yeah, okay, how do we do that? What do we do that? But one, they're coming along advocating for that, but also with an absolutely extremist agenda. An extremist agenda that has not existed in government here before. Let me give you an example. In the 1980s, there was a Jewish fascist party, and Israel prides itself on a democracy, and with great justification, It's used the catchphrase, and I believe it's right, the only democracy in the Middle East to date. In the 1980s, a party came along, an extremist party, fascist Jewish theological party, wanted the country to be a theological state, not a democratic state, by a man called Rabbi Meir Kahane. In the 1980s, his party was banned. In the 1980s, you were not allowed, he had been in the parliament, he was banned from being in parliament, banned from running in elections for being racist. The other night, 3-4 nights ago, I'm in Tel Aviv at the pro-democracy demonstration. There's a line of people waving the flags of the Kahanist movement. So for all these years, they've been contained, illegal, and now they feel it's our time. And every element of life in this country would, as a free society, would change. The ministers, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, are from the extremist parties who are pushing this legislation, saying that, proposing things like in hospitals on a Jewish holiday of Passover, which you traditionally don't eat bread. This sounds like a minor thing, but you can't take bread into a hospital. So we are legislating what you were allowed to eat and not eat if you were sick during this holiday. Or hotels and government businesses should be allowed to decline services to LGBTQ individuals if that is their preference. So they have no protection against anti-discrimination laws. So these ministers and this party actually come from a very anarchic tradition. There has been, Ben Gvir, the minister, has himself been arrested. There is in the West Bank this movement called Hilltop Youth, who say, right, there's the official settlements that get the support of the Israeli government and protected by the army. And then there's a more extremist element who say, well, no, we're going to run over that hill and we're going to take it over and build a settlement without the support of government and anything. Ben Gvir has been part of this historically. He's been arrested as a younger man. So these kind of, it's a bit of a case, if you know the phrase from To Kill a Mockingbird, you know, the lunatics are taking over the asylum.
A phrase similar to that was popping into my head. Isn't there a bribery angle also? Netanyahu is facing corruption charges.
Okay, so that's a very good question, because the issue is, does Netanyahu actually believe this? Now, I mentioned to you already we have coalition government. Benjamin Netanyahu is the head of the Likud party. The Likud party is a traditional centre-right political party. It's not an extremist party. To the contrary, its foundations, pre the State of Israel and for the many years of the state's existence, it was actually an advocate in its philosophy and its ideology of a liberal democracy. The founders of the ideological founders of this party, Zev Jabotinsky and its longtime leader, Menachem Begin, they were actually jurists, and they spoke about the need for checks and balances and independence. So why is the leader of that party all of a sudden undoing its whole history and taking a moderate centre-right party to the extreme right and actually turning it into something completely different? So the question here is, does he believe it? He's not himself a religious man even. However, you know, power corrupts, and essentially he's been the leader of the Likud for almost 30 years. That's a long time, right? Do you lose your objectivity in your direction? But secondly, he was under investigation for corruption. And there was this issue of whether a serving prime minister could serve as prime minister, and indeed other ministers. There was another minister who has been a proposed minister who's barred from office, Aryeh Deri, because of convictions against him. And essentially, it is argued, and I don't know what's, you know, I'm just a documentary filmmaker. I don't know what's in Bibi Netanyahu's head. If he can get these clearly he loves power, committed to holding power, and he has been found to be, or alleged to be, corrupt in his governance of power, that the Supreme Court could prevent him from being in office and holding office. If he can shift the power and the dynamic within the Supreme Court, then his prospects of being found guilty of corruption and therefore not being able to be prime minister would go out the window. So is his motive, and a lot of people here feel there's a chance. It's people on the protesters go, Bibi labaita, Bibi labaita, which means Bibi, go home, just go home, right? And why are they saying go home? They're saying go home because he wants to bring the whole house of Israel, the state of Israel, down with him to save his own skin. Just to give you an example, on Sunday night this week, I was on the phone to a journalist just talking about, well, what's going to happen this week? What should I be filming? She said, oh my God, I've got to go, and slammed the phone down, which when a journalist does that, you know something big has happened. So Netanyahu had just fired the Minister of Defense who was from his Likud party, because the Likud are not traditionally an extremist party. And the defense minister said, we shouldn't be doing this law. It's causing such a backlash. Two things. One, people are refusing to go and do their reserve military service. And Israel prides itself on having a people's army. How can you have a people's army if you don't have a democracy? And Israel's enemies are looking in from the outside, and unfortunately there are a lot of them, Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and saying the state now, people don't want to serve the country, or there's a risk that people won't want to serve the country, because why would you if it's extremist and not democratic? And so he fired the defense minister. I then get a WhatsApp message from the journalist saying, go down to the protest site. I get down there about 10 o'clock. There are thousands upon thousands of people just ascending in every direction. The police put up barriers. The mass of people just removed the barriers and took over the main freeway. In their tens and hundreds of thousands, I left when the battery on my camera died at about 12:30 at night. And I'm just walking back to where I'm staying about 15 minutes away. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people descending, because the feeling was that Netanyahu would even threaten undermine the security well-being of this precarious country to protect himself. And it seems that, so on Monday, this was like the last straw for everyone. The Histadrut, the trade union movement, announced a general strike. If you were flying out, the airport basically closed. Public services, the Israeli embassy in New Delhi and the Israeli consulate in Mumbai, you wouldn't have been able to go to on Monday because all public servants in Israel went on strike, or many public servants in Israel went on strike. Even McDonald's, the McDonald's chain in Israel, closed. Everyone went on strike. And he realized he'd gone too far, Netanyahu. The pressure was reaching a crescendo. And so he's a very smart, cunning politician. That evening, Monday evening, the next day, he called a halt for dialogue. Now, most people think, in his cunning way, he's just buying time. But what did he agree to in this halt? He agreed to stop the legislation for a month, basically. And he also agreed to give Ben Gvir from the Jewish Power extremist party, he agreed to proceed with giving him a special militia. And you go, hold on a second, what's going on? This is a country that has a reputation for having a very strong army, the best army in the Middle East, arguably one of the best in the world, a very skilled police force. Why does it need an armed militia that responds and is commanded not by a professional, but by an extremist politician? I mean, this is on a whole new level. So on the one hand, he agreed, okay, I'll postpone the legislation, but in doing it, to getting the agreement of the extremist Jewish Power Party, I'll give you a militia. So he'll do anything to stay in power, basically.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hi, my name is Abbas. You can catch me and Urjita Wani on Has It Aged Well? Joining us is Instagram influencer and actress Sameera Reddy. We talk about her time at the movies, what she does on Instagram, and try and remind her of the plot of Taxi 921. You can find the episode on the IBM Pop feed and YouTube channel.
Hi, I'm Anupam Gupta, and on Paisa Vaisa, I speak with Deepak Sharma, President and Chief Digital Officer at Kotak Mahindra Bank, about how digital is transforming the customer experience. And we talk about credit cards, loans, and all the other products that banks offer and how digital is changing that entire experience.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. Yeah, somewhat cynical calculation.
It's a mild way of putting it.
You must have spoken to participants from all sections of society participating. Does it cut across, of course, age groups and genders, but also ideologies, also all kinds of people, including the minorities?
I mean, yes, supporters of the government are trying to tarnish the protest movement as left-wing, as if democracy is a left-wing thing rather than a universal thing. That's not the case. It's not the case depending on how you define left and right. If you define left and right on the political spectrum, generally, then no, it cuts across the divide. You know, there are protests here in every city, and Israel's a very kind of diverse society. You have metropolitan center like around Tel Aviv, and then you have more remote communities, and then you have settlements in the West Bank, and then you have a more religious city like Jerusalem. There are religious groups protesting. There have been protests in the more moderate settlement communities in the West Bank. There are people from the Sephardi tradition, the Oriental tradition of Jewry, and the Ashkenazi, sort of more white tradition. So no, I would say it cuts across the political divide. However, the supporters of the government, and I was in Jerusalem the other night where there was the first basically major protest in support of the government. And I was there and the buses were coming in, basically all religious and right-wing political extremists, for the most part, you could see coming in from the West Bank. So in terms of, you know, you spoke before about protests lasting 4 or 5 days. I used to live in a suburb of Tel Aviv called Ra'anana. I was talking to a friend who lived there. Very middle class, kind of regular society, not hip activist like Tel Aviv, not religiously inspired like Jerusalem, just a regular middle class. And this friend explains that they went out the other night. Every basically week there have been here days of national protest. People have been taking off from their work, going to roads and protesting and waving flags, stopping traffic. And this has happened in this particular community. Regular, middle class, middle-aged people going out on the streets. And he said to me, and then he saw the other night, there was a water cannon there. And I thought, oh my God, if a water cannon has come to this community, if we are now the regular, middle class, middle-aged people are the radicals, everyone's been galvanized. And I got to say, you feel at times that this country is on the brink, because it's not an exaggeration to say this is an existential issue. Because the question is, can Israel survive if it is not a democracy? Can it survive internally where you have this eclectic mix of Jews and non-Jews? India is a very diverse society, maybe one of the most diverse in the world, right, in terms of language and regions and religions and castes. So Israel, but people come together under this broad framework of Jewish and democratic. Can it survive, or would it actually split? Could, God forbid, there be a civil war? And given that it has countries and forces that actually want to physically destroy it, cease to exist. Iran with its nuclear weapons, Hezbollah in Lebanon, extremist Shiite group, and Hamas in Gaza. If Israel, you know, one thing that is holy here or sanctified here is the army, because it's called the great equalizer. Everyone, whether you're rich, you're poor, you're religious, secular, there are religious people who don't serve in the army, but you go and you serve together. And you do reserve duty. So you do your core service, and then you go back to your normal life, but you're called up once a year for a month, and also if there's a military action. And this is the most sanctified element of this society. And the unprecedented has happened. Pilots, who are the elite of the military, have been saying, we're not going to do our reserve duty now with this agenda, because we're not serving a dictatorship. There was at the demonstrations, there are people in green T-shirts, and it's with a slogan, but essentially it's reservists against the legislation, refusing to go and do their reserve duty because they're prepared to put their lives on the line for this country. They're willing to do that, but they're willing to do that if it's a democratic country, not a dictatorship. And so it really is the most critical moment. If you write, when the history of this country is written, whichever way this pans out politically, this is going to be a major chapter. If you sit down to write that book, and you go, okay, in 1947, the United Nations decided to divide Palestine, British mandated Palestine, and create two states, right? That's the sort of division very familiar to your audience in India. And then in 48, declared independence. The 6 Day War, this will be there. And we don't yet know which way it's going to go. But I've got to tell you, I go through experiences of elation and depression over this. One, the elation that the love, passion, care, identification, and belief in this country is so strong that hundreds of thousands of people are prepared to demonstrate week in, week out, because they love it, they care for it, they know that this is the only home for Jews. There's only one Jewish state. And the civil society, if I was a professor, which I used to be, and I needed to teach a master class on civil society activism, and maybe this is the reason why a dictatorship won't happen, well, this would be my case study. On the other hand, I've got to be honest with you, right? We're in the media. We're not in the propaganda business. I have people from the local crew that I'm using to film with, and people who I've spoken to on the streets in making this documentary who say, we're looking at, getting foreign passports, having a backup plan. There's no way we'd stay here if this happened. And I kind of go from this swing of emotions of, yes, civil society, it's leading the way, to, but if the worst happens, the worst will happen.
Yeah, that's a very, it's almost quasi-depressive state to be in, because, when you think of the country you grew up in and where people came from all over the world, splitting. On the other hand, there are several things that glue the country together. The Supreme Court is one of them, as you said. What are diaspora communities saying? You live in Australia, and diaspora communities tend to be, in my experience, I don't want to generalize, somewhat conservative.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I live in Australia. I'm from the United Kingdom, so I am familiar. And before I became a full-time filmmaker, I used to be an academic, and the Israel-diaspora relationship was one of my areas of expertise. Generally speaking, traditionally speaking, we have what's called a mobilized model, where the diaspora stands by the homeland. And your assessment, I mean, of course, nothing is ever quite black and white, but it's generally true, more kind of conservative. And the diaspora has been a great friend of Israel, stood solidly by Israel, which I believe has been right and helpful. I've personally had conversations with individuals in leadership positions in the diaspora saying, you need to speak out about this. Israel needs to hear that the concern about this is not just within the Jewish and non-Jewish population within Israel, but extends across the diaspora, not out of hatred, not out of anti-Zionism, not out of the boycott disinvestment movement, but out of identification with the state as Zionist, as the Jewish homeland. And I get varied responses. And, you know, I think, well, the Australian Jewish community is particularly conservative, but there have been unprecedented statements. There have been, in a park at the end of my street where I live in Melbourne, there was a protest, a civil society protest against the Israeli government's legal changes. There have been protests in Bibi Netanyahu went to London recently. Normally, the Jewish community, he would be feted and praised and adhered to and lauded. You know, there were protests on the streets by the Jewish community against the Prime Minister of Israel. I'm not talking about these fringe groups, Jews against Zionism or what have you, who are totally peripheral and anti-Zionist. I'm talking about people who love and care and support the state, who are coming out against the visiting Prime Minister. The same has happened in America. American Jewish groups, leadership groups, groups like the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, I'm talking about major Jewish organizations, have come out with statements saying the legislation needs to stop. I don't get the impression that Netanyahu is listening. And there is a danger here. It's very much a secondary danger to the future of democracy in Israel. But there's a danger here, longer term, that Israel and the diaspora could fall further apart as a result. Because if your values, if you live in Western or democratic countries, is democracy is a basic tenet, and then you see that that's not the case in Israel, then your identification with it would be diminished. So no, this has extended, this has galvanized not just Israeli civil society, but also the diaspora. And I don't think Bibi, you know, it's not just that Bibi Netanyahu has been told he won't be welcome to the White House, which would be a big dent to his ego. I think he's also not going to be welcome in Jewish diaspora circles. And that's pretty unprecedented. This whole thing is unprecedented. The scale of protests, the length of the protests, the way the protests have come and captured all sectors of society and extended beyond the state to the diaspora shows that we're very much in uncharted waters, and at a critical juncture. The feeling in the streets here is palpable. And, you know, I'm just sitting in an apartment talking to you from Tel Aviv, and there's the organized big protests, and then I can be sitting here and I hear chants. You know, one of the chants is Demokratia, Demokratia, democracy, democracy. And then there'll be 100, 200 people just walking along with flags. When the minister was fired the other night, I was sitting in the apartment, and all of a sudden car horns start going off. You know, everyone to the tune Demokratia, Demokratia. It is everywhere. The protests are organized through WhatsApp, basically. There are WhatsApp groups, and the messages are coming fast and furious. It's impossible to keep up with it. There's going to be a demonstration here. There's going to be a protest there. There's going to be this tomorrow and this today. And there are also more kind of forums, coffee shop forums. It is everywhere. You cannot escape it. The country is completely galvanized by it. And maybe that is the cause for hope, you know, that people care so much, they love so much, they know what's at stake. Civil society is so sophisticated in this country. And going back to the diaspora, there have been a number of articles by leading Jewish intellectuals who are involved in Israel diaspora affairs, who have actually said, we need the diaspora to speak up. There is an organization called the Jewish Agency for Israel, which kind of governs the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. It doesn't involve itself in political matters. The head of the Jewish Agency just the other day stood up and said, this needs to stop. No one is untouched by it. And just, I want to go back and just say one thing about the security of the country, just so people understand how defiant Bibi Netanyahu is. You have the high-tech sector, which, this startup country, who are basically saying, the leaders are coming out very formally and saying, we are going to relocate overseas. There's going to be a brain drain. There's going to be a lack of investment. The economic consequences for this country could be catastrophic. The former governors of the Bank of Israel, Nobel Prize winning economists, have said this will be an economic disaster. Militarily, you've had the former heads, chiefs of staff of the military, heads of the Mossad, heads of the Shin Bet, the internal security, have said this is a danger to our security and well-being. Netanyahu doesn't seem to care. So I think when you talk about, it's not just young, hippie, left-wing teenagers with hipster long beards and tattoos on their arms who are demonstrating, just to cast a stereotype, and who are opposed to this. It's the highest level economic, military, security, who are standing there side by side with the protesters in the streets week after week after week. And it's not going to, it's not going to end until this ends.
Have the minorities too understood that it's important for them, or they feel that it's not their concern? The Arabs, the Muslims.
No, the Arab minority get it. I mean, they would be on the front line. I mean, recently there was a tragic, heartbreaking incident where there was, in the West Bank, in a village, an Arab village, a Jewish car was driving through, someone was shot, I can't remember the details, I think they were killed, and a bunch of settlers went to this Arab town and basically inflicted a pogrom. And I mean, that's in the West Bank, which is slightly different, but it just gives you an example of what could happen if this legislation gets through. And the Arab minority in Israel absolutely understands, perhaps more acutely than anyone else, but although everyone else gets it, what's at stake, because the parties who are the extremist parties who are really pushing this, are essentially anti-Arab. So the first rights that they would curtail, would be those of the Arabs. I mean, I'm making a prediction here. It's not like they've put forward legislation we're going to curtail. But logically, their first ones would be the Arabs. And, if you say, and there are, first it might be Arabs, then it might be gay people, and then it might be women from across the sector. So, yes, they are. I was at the Jerusalem protest at the Parliament at the Knesset the other day. The leader of one of the Arab parties was right there at the front, speaking to people, being there, alongside Yair Lapid, the main opposition leader, and Benny Gantz, the Yair Lapid, the sort of centrist leader, Merav Michaeli, the Labour Party, the left-wing leader, and this leader of the Arab Party was there too. So everyone gets it. You don't need to be a professor of political science or any other rocket scientist to get this. It's not that complex. Democracy is a system of governance that ensures our freedoms. Take that away and anything could happen. And history has taught us that. And as Jews, history has taught us that very acutely. And so I think there is this great sensitivity and understanding to that. And hopefully that will lead to these protests to prevail. But, I'm not a prophet, so I don't know.
Okay, that I can see you are still in a dilemma being there. Thank you, Danny, for this lucid analysis about what's happening in Israel, which, as you say, could decide the country's future. That was Danny Ben Moshe, a documentary filmmaker who's in Israel to make a VR, virtual reality documentary on the protests that have been going on for the past 3 months. We'll be back once again next week with another guest on the Wire Talks. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the team, goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hi, my name is Abbas. You can catch me and Urjita Wani on Has It Aged Well? Joining us is Instagram influencer and actress Sameera Reddy. We talk about her time at the movies, what she does on Instagram, and try and remind her of the plot of Taxi 921. You can find the episode on the IVM Pop feed and YouTube channel.
On Just a Filmy Game Show with me, Antariksh Thakkar, I am joined by hilarious content creators Zerwan Bansha and Jagjot Singh, aka Aapka Jugs. They fight to become the biggest Bollywood divana by guessing how much movies like Bodyguard and Chennai Express made at the box office. Tune into the episode on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast from. Only on the IVM Pop channel.